we want to continue to have high quality services for kids. That's what AEAs are about. But we know it's going to have to shift. And so we know there will be a level of service still there, but it is going to be different.
Welcome to Cornhole Champions, a weekly podcast powered by Iowa Starting Line, where we throw bags at the state's biggest stories. I'm Zachary Oren Smith. It's Wednesday, and I'm joined today by Iowa Starting Line's community editor, Amie Rivers. In 2024, Representative Mariannette Miller-Meeks encored her razor-thin margin from 2020, but she's calling foul and blaming a poll that didn't even mention her name. We dig into a decision by the Scott County attorney not to pursue criminal charges against Andrew Wold, the landlord whose building collapsed in Davenport, killing 3 men. Finally, we're talking education dollars. We hear about the impact on one area education agency trying to right its ship. That's coming up on Cornhole Champions. So, Amie.
Did you just open a beer?
I wish. No, I opened a sparkling beverage, and I wanted to know, like, what's your if you in the perfect world, what is your beverage ideal scenario?
My ideal beverage?
Wrong. Your beverage ideal scenario, right? So I'll give you an example. For me, I want like a sparkling something. I want something with like lots of bubbles, right? To get the burps out, right? Because the thing about me is I got lots of burps to give to this world, right? But I also need something a little caffeinated, right? So sometimes there's a sparkling water and a tea, perhaps, a coffee, if you will.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's also a soda. I've been dabbling in soda recently, which has been we'll stick a pin in that.
You mean pop, though?
I really don't know what you're talking about. Tell me about your ideal beverage situation.
Coffee in the morning for sure. Big coffee drinker.
Hot coffee, cold coffee.
Hot coffee for sure. Yeah.
Hot coffee for sure.
Yeah,
That's
maybe
the right
in
way.
the summer. We used to do some like iced coffee and put it in the fridge and then just have that on hand. Yeah, it's nice.
I think cold coffee is for sickos. I think it's like an insane.
When it's hot though, it's nice. I think it's more insane when it's like 80 degrees and you're trying to like get your caffeine for the day and it's just hot on top of hot.
If it's hot, you know what hot coffee does? It brings up your core temperature, right? So it feels less hot. This is science.
Is that right?
This is basically science, Amie. Why? What do you not believe science, Amie? It sounds like you don't believe.
Why would
in
bringing up your
science.
core temperature help your situation of being less hot?
Because your experience then of the heat is like, oh, it's actually like kind of normal out here. It feels like my body temperature out here.
You're just used to it at that point. It's like late winter when it's like it gets down to 30 degrees and you're like, I don't need a coat. It's sunny. It's fine. Because you're used to it by that point. But when it's like 30 degrees in November, you're like, bundle up.
Amie,
basically.
It's wild how I get 10 episodes of a podcast and I'm already like have like some crock science takes that I'm putting out into the world. Like it took all of 10 episodes for me to be saying, well, if you believe the science, actually, magnets cure cancer or cause it.
This is Zach's bid to get into HHS.
I'm trying to become the RFK's undersecretary. It's true.
Yes.
I have a lot of other lousy takes.
We'll save them for the next podcast.
First story. In 2020, Representative Mariannette Miller-Meeks won her seat by one of the closest margins in U.S. history. This past year, she repeated, winning by less than 0.2 percentage points, leading one Iowa politics writer to say that, quote, there may be no luckier person in Iowa politics than Representative Mariannette Miller-Meeks. Apparently getting lucky isn't good enough for our congresswoman. You've, of course, heard that President Donald Trump is suing the Des Moines Register, its parent company, Gannett, and J.N. Seltzer, the pollster, claiming that the poll that they published leading up to the November election last year was constituted election interference, constituted consumer fraud. On Friday, Trump's legal team filed an amended complaint adding Mariannette Miller-Meeks' name to the mix, as well as losing candidate Brad Zahn, who used to represent Urbandale in the state Senate.
This poll confounded all of us. I
Oh my
think.
God. Do you remember, where were you? Where were you when you first saw
Where were you?
the Ann Seltzer Iowa poll leading up to last
Have we
November?
just missed this whole groundswell of support? Maybe Seltzer's onto something. She's got an A+ rating. There was definitely a part of me that was like, what? Why don't you just remind us, Zachary? What happened with this poll?
So it's let's take it back. It's November 2nd. I'm a month into my job with my very exciting title as political correspondent. And what should I see on Twitter other than new Iowa poll drops? Vice President Harris to sweep Iowa by 3 percentage points. Let's be clear. The spiciest take I can imagine coming out of an Iowa poll would be that a Democrat was going to win
Right.
Iowa, but you were there, right? I remember everyone just being full of excitement, and this was like kind of this narrative shaking moment leading up to the election by a pollster, Ann Seltzer, who's been doing this for years, right? She occasionally has gotten a couple of these wrong. She's kind of known for being the person that bucks the trend, right? That will
Right.
have, she was the one that predicted Obama's like sweep of the Iowa
Yeah.
caucuses. She's been such a reliable voice, kind of like in calling these elections ahead of time and getting a sense of like where Iowa's head's at.
Yeah, she's no crank. And
she's no
it
crank.
had implications outside of Iowa. If Iowa was going to go Harris, there were going to be a lot more red states or a lot more fringe states that were going to go Harris, and that had a lot of implications across the country. So yeah,
That's exactly right. It was that poll came out on November 2nd. It claimed that Harris would be up by 3 percentage points. Trump's actual lead was 13 points above that. So it was a whiff, a categorical whiff.
she wasn't even in the ballpark.
A whiff of such magnitude. It really is remarkable how excited we all got, given kind of what we know to be true about Iowa's rightward shift, particularly for Donald Trump.
Okay, so she whiffed. Big deal. Why is Trump mad about this? Like, and why is he taking it out in this fashion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to put this in context of kind of what Trump has been doing since the election, right? It's not enough to win an election, right? These are folks that that want to be loved. They want complete supplication, right? And so you're seeing the headlines right now about the coming CBS settlement. You saw the ABC Disney settlement, right? Millions of dollars paid, not necessarily because Trump had a case, but because it's with Trump in power, right? And many of these larger media companies, in the process of their own acquisitions and process of trying to do business with the government, there's this like question of both like, how do we make sure that we are maintaining solid relationships with what has been a pretty vindictive Trump administration thus far? And I think it's really important that when we were talking about kind of the impact that this has on institutions like the Des Moines Register, which is named in the lawsuit, in context of what we call SLAP suits. So SLAP is an acronym for a strategic lawsuit against public participation, coined in 1980 by two University of Denver professors who were studying the impact that civil complaints and counterclaims can have on public speech, on kind of people's ability to make their voices heard. SLAPs are often brought by businesses, government bodies, or elected officials against those who would oppose them on issues of public concern. In the case of business interests, the filers may be seeking to protect economic interests, right, as a way of preventing certain stories from coming out. SLAPs are often filed by these very well-funded organizations against media organizations, which, as we've discussed on this podcast and elsewhere, Gannett is an embattled company, right? Despite it being the largest operator of newspapers in the United States, it has a tremendous debt load from an earlier merger. On top of that, many of these news agencies depend on access as a kind of currency for their work, right? And so if they have a White House correspondent for USA Today, Gannett's flagship newspaper, has if the Trump administration knows that they're suing the parent company of USA Today, how does that impact that reporter's access? How does that impact their ability to do their job? It's two ways, right? There's this on one hand, having to go to court's really expensive, having to litigate's really expensive. There are some examples of in fact right now in the Iowa legislature there is a bill, kind of an anti-SLAPP lawsuit bill that would prevent companies, government from being able to go after institutions for their free speech rights. We were supposed to value freedom of speech in this country, right? We're supposed to value things. Things like honest, fact-checked reporting. But as we're seeing, Representative Mariannette Miller-Meeks signing on to a lawsuit that's going out to try to silence an institution in a poll just because it didn't have an outcome that she liked.
I mean, she won, right? Trump won. Mariannette Miller-Meeks won. Brad Zahn lost, I guess.
Brad Zahn lost. I mean, maybe that's the cost. Maybe like Ann Seltzer spent her whole career thinking, like, how do I get rid of that pesky Brad Zahn? Right?
Success. She finally got him.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like, what was accomplished is kind of a great question. We knew back in 2020 that her district was split on as to whether or not to support her. She won her election when all votes were counted by 6 votes, right? Out of nearly, was it like 500,000 people that cast ballots that year? The same was true 4 years later when Mariannette Miller-Meeks found that only a 700-person margin separated her from Democrat Christina Bohannon. This is just a district that feels kind of ambivalently about Representative Mariannette Miller-Meeks and continues to show it at the polls. So it didn't. I mean, it certainly didn't change much, but it certainly shows her priorities, right? By willing to sign on to this lawsuit. I was reading through the complaint this morning, and this caught my eye, and I'm quoting here. The odds of a pollster with the experience and track record of Seltzer innocently missing the presidential race by 16 points in all 4 Iowa congressional races by 16 points in the 1st district, 11 points in the 2nd district, 12 points in the 3rd district, and 18 points in the 4th district, respectively, and favoring Democratic candidates with all 5, quote, misses are outside any reasonable range of error. What they're talking about there is that the data that Seltzer collected, the survey data that she collected, found in each of these cases the same thing, right? Which is that Democrats far outperformed kind of what we would think of as their chances in these races. But doesn't that just speak to like the consistency of that data, right? Like had it been had Harris been up 3 points, but Republicans been up across or throughout the rest of the ticket, I think it would be pretty suspect, right? Why would this one be an outlier within this poll, right?
Yeah.
But what we saw in this was that just across the board, Democrats overperformed in her poll. And in retrospect, right? There's some part of this that we can predict, right? Representative Ashley Henson, a very popular candidate in northeastern Iowa, it was kind of strange to hear her competitor, the Democrat, was Sarah Corkery, being up as far as she was, given that she didn't have the fundraising, she didn't have the same sort of campaign prowess, she didn't have the same sort of support that Ashley Henson did. It was pretty remarkable to find her up as far as she was. That might have been an early sign, right? That we need to take a fatter grain of salt with this particular poll. But
we used to be a swing state not that long ago. I mean, you and I are old enough to remember that.
That's true.
I am anyway. I don't know, but
yeah,
and that district has swung. I mean,
That's right.
It was represented by Abby Finkenauer for a long time before it switched to Hinson. So I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility, including in a time when we really did think that there was a lot of momentum behind Harris, and that could have driven people to the polls because we know that presidential races tend to bring out enthusiasm. So if you're already thinking maybe it could happen and then you see this poll on top of it, sure, maybe that inspires you or gives you optimism or maybe moves the needle for some folks to go to the polls. But the fact was it really didn't move the needle. And so I would be very curious to see if anything comes out of this lawsuit. Honestly,
Yeah,
do you think it will?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and I have no I have no insight than anyone else listening has on this lawsuit. I do think it's remarkable that this is the place where people decided to dig in. Right, polls get things wrong. Right,
Right.
That just kind of happens. Right, it's kind of like a weather report. Ann Seltzer often thing she often repeats is that a poll is is like a check, a moment in time, a look at how people on that day at that moment were feeling. And it appears that for the people that she spoke to for her poll, using her methodology, which is all public, by the way, that on those days they were feeling Harris, right? They had that they were in the coconut tree at least for a time.
Kamala-mentum.
But they fell out of that tree, as we saw with the results of the election. And I just think it's interesting that despite winning the thing that matters, they still are spoiled sports about their own victory.
The theme is pettiness. I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Maybe it was pettiness the whole time. The secret, the secret Dr. Pepper, the secret 24th flavor in Dr. Pepper was pettiness.
Pettiness gives it a nice bitter aftertaste.
Second story, there will be no criminal charges filed against Andrew Wold, the owner of an apartment building in downtown Davenport that collapsed, killing 3 people, injuring 1, and displacing 100. Scott County Attorney Kelly Cunningham walked through her decision with the Quad City Times Dispatch Argus reporters this week. Amie, the two of us, me at IPR, you at Iowa Starting Line, we were on the ground covering this story. What do you remember about this story?
I remember walking up and seeing Lisa Brooks walking around talking to folks. She was the woman that they had to go in and rescue a day later after the part of the building collapsed and she couldn't get out, and talking about how she just woke up not knowing what was going on and then looking at her building and how scared she was. And I mean, just the amount of but you talk to everyone and no one was like, we couldn't see this coming. They could all see it coming. They knew the condition of their building and what it had been for years. And they had been raising these concerns with their landlord to no avail. And so they were all like, this was waiting to happen. And that was, I think, the recurring theme that I heard that day. What about you? What did you hear?
I was part of the team at IPR that reviewed documents that the city dropped all at once one Friday after. Was it a Friday?
Yeah, that's right.
I can't remember what afternoon it
Probably
was.
was a Friday.
They all dropped. Yeah, they did this massive document drop, and I was the unlucky bastard that got caught having to read through it all that evening. I filed a story at 3 a.m.
It sounds like you.
Yeah, right. Kind of. What the document showed was that as early as February of that year, it collapsed at the end of May. As early as February of that year, the local utility company, Mid-America Energy, had refused to send folks to work on a utility line there, citing concerns over the structural integrity of the western wall of that building. Right.
Yeah.
It has been clear, right, that they have known for months about the issues with this building. Yeah. Cunningham, the Scott County attorney, told me back then that it's under investigation. She was saying people need to be careful, right, about the the willingness they are to kind of imagine that there's criminal charges to be made here. After the Division of Criminal Investigation with the state dropped off their report, kind of what would come out of that, what criminal charge would come out of it, for whom, under what circumstances. Mm-hmm. But as she told the Quad City Times this week, there will be no charges, and she kind of walked through her decision. I'm going to read some from the Quad City Times reporting here. Cunningham said that she first ruled out homicide in the first and second degree and voluntary manslaughter, which Cunningham said all involved someone having the intent to take the life of someone else. Then she turned her attention to involuntary manslaughter, which Cunningham said requires someone already to be engaged in a crime or reckless conduct that causes the death of another person. She gives the example of a deadly boat crash in LeClaire, where a boat owner was convicted of 2 counts of aggravated misdemeanor involuntary manslaughter. He was accused of aiding and abetting the 15-year-old at the wheel who drove recklessly along the LeClaire levee when the boat crashed into and killed 2 other boaters. She reviewed it for aggravated misdemeanor involuntary manslaughter. But for that, the defendant must be engaged in reckless conduct. This would be a person is speeding or is eluding police and unintentionally hits and kills another motorist. That would be an example of misdemeanor involuntary manslaughter. Cunningham said that in her report, the building's owner had not been engaged in a crime or reckless conduct, which I think, like, in context of what we already know, is super interesting. Now, I need to say up front, this DCI report has not been released.
Right.
This has information in it that we are not currently privy to, right? So, maybe based on what's in this report, right, we would all feel a little more comfortable with the outcome. But if you think about Cunningham's reticence to even consider charges, given what we already knew about how long we've known about the structural instability of this building, I do think it's I do think right now it leaves me feeling cold given that February report, right, that they knew since February, right, that this was about the structural instability of this building, and yet they continued to rent the some odd 80 units there in the building. They continued to let people live there, and it took the collapse of a section of the building before anybody did anything about it.
And the deaths of 3 people, which even if he was found to be criminally negligent and somehow given, punishment related to that, it doesn't, that doesn't bring your loved ones back. And obviously there are still going to be civil lawsuits, which is one of the things Cunningham talked about when she said that she wasn't going to release the DCI report. She said she wanted to be part of discovery in these civil lawsuits. So ostensibly, we might eventually be able to see at least portions, maybe redacted portions of the DCI report. But ultimately, I think this news it kind of sucks. It sucks for the families. It sucks for everybody that rented there and then was homeless for a long period of time. And it sucks for everybody that sort of is living in substandard conditions and wonders if there's going to be any justice for that. So basically, the county is saying no.
And I just think it's important anytime you talk about this story to remember Brandon Colvin Sr., Ryan Hitchcock, and Daniel Prian.
Yeah.
These are three lives that we don't get back, right? No matter whether there's a criminal charge or not, the damage has been done. And we'll be following this case as it moves to the kind of civil portion of the trial of kind of claims. There's a class action lawsuit kind of working its way through the courts. We'll see what happens. But our hearts are with the families displaced, the families that lost someone in this process.
And I'm glad to see the Quad City Times still putting resources behind this story. It's a very important one.
They're doing really excellent work on it. So kudos to the Quad City Times reporters. Third story, a state agency that supports K-12 students with special needs is anticipating major restructuring and reductions in the coming year. This after Iowa Republicans' law redirecting their funding and scope of services.
But Zachary, no AEA cuts were supposed to happen. I mean, the legislator told me that specifically over and over again.
It turns out when you reduce the scope of service, when you reduce kind of access and funding for the remaining services, that places like Heartland Area Education Agency write to their staff and say, like, hey, we're still not getting any more money from the state. Hey, we're still dealing with these reductions. First, I think it's important to start with special education. One of the major services tied up in area education agencies or AEAs is they are a large part of how students that need special education services, how they get those services, how they get how IEPs get incorporated into the curriculums of their schools. This is just tremendous supports for the classrooms that they're in. And it's reducing that staff by 45 what are called full-time equivalent positions. So think of that as like 45, what is worth 45 full 40-hour a week employees, right? As opposed to someone like, it could be a mix of part-time, but it's 45 of those FTEs. They're reducing the department that does services for fees, right? So this is like computer science curriculum or professional development for teachers for wanting to learn more about literacy skills, for example. they're reducing that staff from 47 positions to just 15 positions. And on top of that, they're targeting $800,000 in infrastructure cost reductions and a review of support function staff as they're getting ready for kind of to put their budget together. They're going to finalize these cuts in March, but we got access to this email because some of the people on that distribution list said that this isn't right, that we heard all this talk about how AEA's services weren't going to change, but lo and behold, here we are.
What's the goal? Like, is the goal to just like not get help for disabled students? Because a lot of these disabilities just need like a little bit of attention and then they can become full productive members of society. Isn't that what Republicans want? Like, or are you seeing that they're just trying to gut the public school system in general? This is just part of it. Are there more cuts coming?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why would you want an AEA? Why would you want to regionalize these services? Well, if particularly when you're talking about a rural district, right, or you're talking about a smaller district, they're not going to need to have a whole department dedicated to professional development training for staff, right? They're not going to need a whole department built around literacy curriculum making, right? They're not going to need to have, right? But we do need someone working on this, right? We do need people who are staying on top of the literature surrounding the best practices for teaching mathematics, for example, right? The AEAs are part of that infrastructure to help bring best practices and help bring tools to the table, right? So the teachers can then make the maximum use out of them. I think the reason why maybe that these get selected is they're not in the district, right? Reynolds says that special education dollars should be with the districts that are actually providing the special education. One of the things that my conversation with Yelick, the director of Heartland AEA, found is that she said oftentimes these AEA special education folks are like the connective tissue helping students navigate from one school to another, right? They're the like kind of consistent force helping them as they try to like achieve outcomes. And for a family that's dealing with kind of a difficult diagnosis, right? Dealing with trying to find a diagnosis in the first place. These can be really important people in their lives, people trying to get good outcomes for their student. And it really is just a hard time, I think, for these families that are wondering, will my caseworker be there? Will they be able to help get me to the next rung of this ladder?
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Do you think more cuts are coming?
It's an interesting question, right? I mean, like, I think when Reynolds decided to go after the AEAs, this wasn't really something that conservative think tank types were talking a lot about. Most folks, I'm going to tell you, that unless they used AEA services, they didn't even know what the AEAs were, right? And so when Reynolds went after the AEAs and kind of began proposing the cuts that she wanted to do, people spoke up. There was a huge backlash against like kind of her initial proposal, which then got walked back a couple of steps. Cuts still went through. Policy was changed, right? The question whether more cuts are on the way, it's tough to say, right? Currently, we're still implementing the cuts that occur. Currently, we're still implementing the cuts that were passed a year ago, right? At the moment, I think the conversation is around what funding will be available for K-12 districts going forward. Democrats have said they want to see a 5% increase to state supplemental aid. Reynolds is kind of dug in her heels about it being just a 2% figure. And when we're talking about when we're talking about how school funding, we remember that school funding has not kept pace with inflation over time. And now more services are unloaded onto school districts, and those school districts are receiving fewer dollars in actual value to provide those services. I think it raises a really large question, right? That because you don't actually have to, if you're not funding enough to overcome the price of inflation, these are de facto cuts, right? Like whether or not you pass anything, right? Whether or not you say that you're increasing it by 2 percentage points, if that 2 percentage points does not keep pace with inflation,
Right.
that's that's an actual cut, right?
Right.
To my school district's ability to put my kids through a safe learning environment.
Yeah. But that's sort of the point, isn't it? I mean, like, to couch all of this in the larger thing, the idea is to just move the money that we were putting into public education that people have a say in with their democratically elected school board members and put it all into private education. Like, that's sort of the trajectory that we're on. And do you see any stopping that?
I only see, now that we've taken the floodgates off and now there's no income qualification for making use of
Right.
educational savings accounts,
Right.
also known as private school vouchers.
Mm-hmm.
I only expect that program to be more utilized. I think that right now Republicans are clutching their pearls about people like me saying that they're cutting funding. They like to bring up such a large part of Iowa's gross budget. Nearly 50% of Iowa's budget is to fund K through 12 education, right? Which, when you put it like that, right, they say, it sounds huge. They say that, look at someone's budget, and you look at someone's budget, you could see their priorities. This keeps getting repeated in
Heaven
these,
forbid education be a priority.
right. You look at their budget, you can see the priorities in that budget. But if we're cutting services across the board, right, you have to ask yourself, like, is it enough to render the services, right? Is this enough? Is the funding whether 50% or not, if that 50% isn't sufficient to do the job, you have to ask yourself, right? All right, like what is it? What is it that we're prioritizing, right? And if we aren't keeping pace with inflation, I mean, I think we can answer. I think we can answer kind of what our priorities are. Republicans are always trying to talk to me about how bad inflation is, about how that's the reason that we're doing so badly. I believe it.
Right.
I've seen my costs go up. Surely this is a place that we can agree on, right? That
Right.
if anything should keep pace with inflation, it should be the money that we're spending for our future, for our kids.
I bet the vouchers will keep pace with inflation.
Yeah. I bet you're right. For our cornhole matchup this week, I spoke with Heartland AEA's director, Cindy Yelick. She's trying to balance a ship over there like other AEAs and now is in the grips of budget season. She talks to us about the stakes, what happens when these essential services are strained. That's coming up on Cornhole Champions. Good morning. Thanks for joining me today.
Yes, thanks for having me.
We got connected because someone sent me an email that you sent out, I believe it was last week. We connected over that, and I wanted to hear a little bit about, can maybe explain kind of what you were having to explain to the folks that work at the Heartland AEA.
Right. So we are preparing our budget at Heartland for the 25-26 school year. And to do that, we know as a result of House File 2612, we're going to have significant budget reductions for next year. So we are communicating with staff what those reductions are and how that would impact our staffing levels.
I think you cited two major causes of this, right? Like one was continued levels of funding for public education in the state of Iowa, but more importantly, this was the changes to state law related to how how AEAs are run, what are their services, how are they funded. Can you walk me through a little bit of the changes and kind of how you guys experienced them in the past year?
Right. So House File 2612 really called for a 2-year implementation. For this year, 100% of dollars that support special education in the state for services that AEAs provide went to the AEA. For next year, 100% of those dollars go to the school districts, and they must spend 90% of them with their AEA, and then they can use 10% of those special education dollars in their district, maybe to support in-district personnel or other costs that they have in district. So over that 2-year span, we're going from 100% of special education dollars to about 90% of special education dollars. The other two funding streams for an AEA are education services and media services. And over that 2-year span, we are going from those dollars going to the AEA to 100% of those dollars being allocated by the state into a school district's general fund. So that means that a district then will receive those dollars and they can spend them on any costs that are important or they prioritize as a district. So that means that we have no secured funding in the education and media services area. So we went from, 100% of funds supporting those areas to provide services to schools to we have to base our budget on no funds in those areas. And obviously we can sell services to schools, but when you're budgeting, that's not a secure number or a stable number that you can budget off.
Maybe back up a little bit. I think it's important for folks to understand kind of what AEAs are, just given that unless you followed the kind
Right.
of upheaval that when Governor Reynolds kind of made this announcement that we were going to go after the kind of funding structure of these institutions in our states that support the special education, support
Right.
media resources, professional development, et cetera. I don't think many of us knew kind of like what was all tangled up in these institutions called the AEAs. Can you tell me a little bit about kind of how AEAs work in Iowa's education system?
Sure. So actually, the AEAs were formed in the mid 1970s by the state legislature. Chuck Grassley was actually one of the founding fathers of the original AEA bill.
That's a fun fact.
Yep, it is. So this was really kind of parallel to federal law regarding students with disabilities or IDEA legislation. So what it did was it looked at where we were as a state, and at that time we had county systems. And they said, this really isn't equitable for students with disabilities because if you were in one county versus another county, you got different services based on your county system. So what they said is let's pool resources across the state and establish what they called 15 at that time area education agencies. And the original boundaries of the AEAs were the same as the community college boundaries. Over time, AEAs have merged and we now have 9 AEAs. And really, they are their mission was to support schools and children in 3 areas. One of them was education services. That would be providing support for like literacy instruction, math instruction, talented and gifted students, English language learners. And then there was media services, and that provided support to library systems, actual books. Back in the mid 70s, you can imagine there were films, like they literally would check out films, film strips, books. And that area has really evolved since the beginning of the AEAs. Now, a lot of our resources are digital. So media supports, technology supports, helping teachers integrate technology into their teaching, those kinds of things. And the third area, which was the largest area, was special education. And I think what has been really hard for people to understand is the role of an AEA is different than the role of a school district. So a school district for special ed is responsible for providing the instructional component. So they employ the teacher that works directly with the student on their IEP goals, maybe in math and writing. They provide the transportation. In AEA, our role is to do things like evaluate kids to see if they're eligible for special education services. That's called Child Find. We provide direct and related services. So on a student's IEP, it might say they need access to a speech language pathologist 60 minutes a week. We provide that speech language pathologist. It might be an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. If we have a child who is learning to use their cane because they're visually impaired, we provide an orientation and mobility coach. So all those things that help come together so that a student really is able to access education and then make growth on those IEP goals. We will partner with the schools to make sure all those services are provided. But there's a clean line between that school component and that AEA component.
These are for families managing the IEP, school districts managing the IEP of the student. Can you walk me through maybe another example, for instance, just because I think this IEP piece is really important?
So an IEP is an individualized education plan, and that really lays out what supports a student needs so that they're able to succeed and make growth to their educational program. A lot of people don't know that AEA services actually can start at birth. So when a baby is born and they spend time in the neonatal unit or the NICU, they get paired with an AEA consultant, and that consultant helps a family navigate community resources and other supports that the student needs or the baby needs. And we actually provide services in the home from birth to age 3, and then we help transition that student at age 3. If they still have developmental delays and they're needing support, then they might go through an evaluation to see if they're entitled for special ed. At that time, if they are entitled to special education, then an individualized education plan is written, and that lays out goals, maybe in literacy, in speech communication, even in mobility, if it's a student who has those challenges. And it lays out what a student is going to need to access what we call a free and appropriate education, or FAPE.
Education folks love your acronyms.
Yeah, I know they do. But actually, an AEA person could be working with a family from the time a child is born until they reach 21. So if they're eligible for services, and in a lot of communities, families will tell you the AEA people are the ones, as they transition grade to grade or building to building, it's that AEA person who's kind of the constant that provides that support.
And walk me through so you've laid out kind of what the role of AEAs are in Iowa's educational system. You've rolled out, you've explained some of the changes policy-wise, right, that you guys are managing. Walk me through, take us to the present. Take us to the letter that you sent out to teachers, employees, staff in Heartland AEA. What kinds of conversations are you guys having right now as you're trying to both provide maximal services for students under this kind of like new vision for your organizations,
Right.
while also trying to manage some of the funding gaps that you're now experiencing?
So one of the things about the law is that schools would still be eligible to purchase some services, in education services and media services. So what we're really trying to work through right now is, what are those services that districts want to have access to, that they may want to purchase, and then how do we staff for those and support those? I think what's been really hard for staff and for districts and us as we transition is, it we went from one system that was completely accessible and funded for schools, to one where we're saying we're now a business, we're a fee for service, we're charging, so we have to cost everything, we have to see what the market's going to support. So it's really hard to move from one system to the other in a very short time, and provide that steady, consistent access that both districts are used to and that staff are used to providing. And I think one of the things that's been difficult for staff is, they know as our number shrinks, as the number of people that we have on staff, we continue to downsize, they're going to have to serve in a different way. And so some services or some supports probably won't be available in the same way. And so that's been a tough message just for us to give staff and for us to give schools.
What are you hearing from parents, the kind of parental level, right at this moment?
For this year, services didn't have a big shift. So even though this was the first year of implementation, all the AEAs used a lot of one-time funding. For an example, Heartland sold a building, and so we were able to use those resources to support our budget for this year. So people didn't feel a big shift in services, but they know moving forward. Um, Obviously, when it's one-time funding like that, that doesn't support your budget for
Right.
in perpetuity. So parents are nervous. I mean, they're saying like, how's it going to be different? We're used to um, somebody coming into our home. I have a child that was born with a delay in hearing, and we're used to having an audiologist and a teacher of the deaf work with us directly. And is that going to shift? And those are all the kinds of things we're sorting out. We want to continue to have high quality services for kids. That's what AEAs are about. But we know it's going to have to shift. And so we know there will be a level of service still there, but it is going to be different.
And then kind of bringing us to a close here, I'd really like to hear you talk about kind of the road ahead, right? When you contract services like this, I think the biggest revelation, right, during the legislative battle was just to kind of the realization of just how much of our infrastructure for special education in the state was tied to our AEAs, was facilitated by our AEAs. And I wonder, for you, as you're thinking about the impacts that these changes are going to have, not just on your own institution, but on other institutions in the state. If you can kind of walk me through what you're watching, what you're thinking about as we move forward.
First and foremost, the AEA system across the state, not just in Heartland, but all 9 AEAs, it is really about high quality services for kids, so that they're all making educational gains. So what we're doing as we move forward is trying to figure out what are those high leverage practices that we can continue to support? What are services that make the difference for kids, and make sure that we're focused on sustaining those? All of us are trying to reduce budgets as far away from kids as possible. So every AEA will have reduced their administrative level by at least 30% by July 1 of 26. And House File 2612 called for that. But the other thing is, in education, as you deal with budget cuts, you always try to cut as far away from students. So what can you do with your internal infrastructure? What can you do administratively so you can keep as many SLPs and OTs and PTs and school psychs in the field as possible? So as we move forward, you're seeing us try to make decisions and try to preserve service for kids. I think one of the things that it's really just important to remember is whether legislatively you agreed with the bill or you don't agree with the bill, everybody in education is really there for kids. And so trying to redesign this as we build it is challenging, but that everybody is trying to make the best possible decisions that we can for students in the state of Iowa.
Cindy Yelick leads Heartland AEA. Cindy, thank you so much for coming online to talk a little bit about this impact that we're continuing to see.
All right. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Amie, what'd you think of Cindy?
It reminds me of when we covered this last year, and we were in the room with the folks who had come en masse to argue that we shouldn't be cutting AEAs. And this woman from Kellogg, Iowa, Suzanne Castillo, had this really amazing clip where she basically called out Republicans for, quote, skimping and skimping and skimping on education. I mean, these parents knew exactly what this was going to do. And it's just, it's frustrating to see all of their fears come true, I'm sure.
It is frustrating. This is a story that we'll be following at Iowa Starting Line for the rest of the session, for the rest of the year. And, if the trajectory continues for Amie, we may be writing about this for the rest of our lives.
Guaranteed job.
That was another episode of Cornhole Champions. If you like the show, please rate it, subscribe, and share it with your friends. While you're at it, sign up for my newsletter at cornholechampions.substack.com and get these episodes straight to your inbox when they drop Wednesday mornings. Cornhole Champions is a weekly podcast powered by Iowa Starting Line. This podcast is produced by me with music from Avery Mossman. Cornhole Champions is a proud member of the Iowa Writers Collaborative. We'll see you with a new episode next Wednesday. Until then, I'm Zachary Oren Smith.
And I'm Amie Rivers.
Thanks for listening.